Have you ever felt tired of proving your intentions? Of always trying to be read the right way, heard the right way, seen the right way? What if peace begins when you stop correcting how you're seen and start living as you are, quietly, without defense? If that thought feels true to you, subscribe. And let's keep learning how to live in calm, even when the world misunderstands. Chapter 1. The hidden engine of fear. There is a quiet force behind much of what we say and do, one that often hides beneath the gentle surface of our politeness and care. We explain our choices at length, justify our tone, and smooth over misunderstandings, believing we do it out of kindness or responsibility. Yet, if we listen carefully to the space between words, we might feel a different current moving underneath, a subtle vibration of fear. It is not the sharp, immediate kind that surges when danger is near, but a slow, continuous pulse that shapes the rhythm of our social lives. It is the fear of being misread, of being thought unkind, of losing connection with those whose opinions quietly govern our sense of safety. Carl Jung once wrote that fear is not merely a signal of danger, but an invitation to transformation. Where your fear is, he said, there lies your task. To Jung, fear marked the border between who we already are and who we might yet become. It revealed the unexamined places in our lives, the habits we built not from freedom, but from avoidance. And when we examine the habit of constant explanation, we begin to see how deeply fear is woven into it, not as weakness, but as inheritance. Human beings evolved to belong. Long before cities, before speech, before writing, survival depended on our ability to stay in harmony with the group. Acceptance was safety. Exclusion meant exposure. The human brain, shaped by millennia of interdependence, learned to treat disapproval as a form of danger. Even now, when someone frowns or withdraws, the same ancient circuitry ignites. The amygdala signals alarm, cortisol surges, muscles tighten in preparation for defense. Our nervous system does not distinguish between a predator's gaze and a peer's disappointment. Both feel like threat. And so, when we sense disconnection, we reach for words as our shield. We explain, elaborate, and justify, not because we are dishonest or insincere, but because on some ancient level, we are trying to stay alive. Jung understood this instinct as part of a larger movement within the psyche, a drive toward equilibrium between inner and outer worlds. When our inner sense of worth depends entirely on the approval of others, that balance collapses. The outer world becomes the mirror through which we measure existence itself, and fear takes control of the dialogue. Every interaction becomes a small test of belonging. Every silence becomes a question we rush to answer. Over time, we forget what it feels like to rest in the simple confidence of being. We grow fluent in self-explanation, but illiterate in self-trust. If we look at this through the lens of physiology, the pattern becomes even clearer. Each time we receive approval, a smile, a nod, a reassuring phrase, our brain releases a cocktail of oxytocin and dopamine that soothes the body and temporarily quiets the alarm system. Each time approval is withheld, stress hormones rise, nudging us to restore connection as quickly as possible. The body learns that safety equals harmony, and that harmony must be protected through appeasement. What began as an adaptive mechanism becomes a psychological loop. Fear, explanation, relief, and back to fear again. Jung would say that what is unconscious rules us until it is made conscious. The moment we begin to see this loop, to name it, to trace its rhythm, something subtle shifts. Awareness opens a space between impulse and action. We start to recognize that the urge to explain is not always a response to reality, but to memory, a bodily memory of separation that may no longer apply. In that recognition lies the possibility of freedom. Freedom, however, is rarely comfortable at first. The moment we stop explaining ourselves, silence appears, and silence feels dangerous. Without reassurance, our nervous system trembles. Doubt floods in. Have I said enough? Do they think I'm cold, arrogant, careless? The mind searches for confirmation that we are still safe, still accepted. But if we can stay with that discomfort, if we can let the silence stretch without filling it, a different experience emerges. Slowly, the body learns a new association, that safety can exist even without agreement, that peace can coexist with uncertainty. Each time we resist the pull to over-justify, we train the nervous system to find calm within, not from without. This process is not about arrogance or detachment. It is about integrity. To stop explaining yourself is not to stop caring about others, but to recognize that care built on fear is not true care. Genuine empathy arises when we no longer need to manage how we are perceived. It comes from stillness rather than anxiety. When Jung spoke of individuation, the lifelong movement toward wholeness, he implied precisely this: the redirection of energy from outer performance to inner coherence. In that turning inward, relationships actually deepen, because authenticity replaces performance. We listen without pretense, speak without rehearsal, and allow differences to exist without panic. Imagine for a moment a conversation where you resist the impulse to explain. Someone misunderstands your intention. You feel the familiar rise of heat in your chest, the instinct to defend. Instead of rushing to repair the image, you pause. You breathe. You allow the misunderstanding to exist for a while. Nothing collapses. The world does not end. What changes is the quality of your presence. You begin to sense a quiet confidence emerging. Not pride, not indifference, but the recognition that your worth does not fluctuate with perception. The fear that once controlled your words begins to lose its authority. Over time, this shift rewires not only relationships, but identity itself. The approval that once acted as oxygen becomes less necessary for survival. The nervous system learns to regulate from the inside. The psyche begins to trust its own stability. Jung might call this the transformation of energy. The same psychic force that once drove us to seek reassurance becomes the fuel for self-possession. What once felt like fear becomes clarity. To see fear this way is to reclaim it. Fear is not the proof that we are failing at life. It is the evidence that we are alive within it. It shows us where our edges are, where growth is asking to occur. The need for approval, then, is not a moral flaw, but a map of tenderness, a sign pointing toward the places where love once felt conditional. When we bring awareness there, when we stay with the pulse of anxiety instead of rushing to quiet it through explanation, something profound happens. The same fear that once controlled us becomes the energy that steadies us. Jung believed that every psychological symptom hides a purpose. The over-explainer, the people-pleaser, the careful diplomat. These are not broken selves, but selves that once learned to survive through harmony. The task is not to shame them, but to listen. Beneath every justification lies a wish to be safe, and beneath that wish lies a deeper truth, that safety cannot come from being understood. It can only come from understanding oneself. When we begin to live from that understanding, everything around us changes in tone. We speak more slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of presence. We hear criticism without collapsing into apology. We share thoughts not to persuade, but to connect. The air around us feels lighter because we are no longer holding our breath for approval. We can simply exist, whole and human, unedited. And that is what Jung meant when he said that fear marks the path. It is not the barrier, it is the doorway. The moment we stop explaining ourselves, we do not step away from the world. We step into it more fully. We meet life not as a performance seeking applause, but as an encounter between equals. What was once the hidden engine of fear becomes the quiet rhythm of trust. And from that rhythm, something extraordinary begins. The experience of peace that does not depend on being seen. Chapter 2. The biology of reassurance. Every craving for approval begins not in thought, but in the body. Long before we can explain it, we feel it. An ache beneath the ribs when someone disapproves. A tightening in the throat when our opinion is dismissed. A flush of warmth when another person nods in agreement. These sensations seem emotional, yet they are biological, woven into the chemistry that has kept human beings alive for hundreds of thousands of years. If we trace them carefully, we begin to see how Jung's understanding of fear as an inner signal finds its mirror in the language of our nervous system. In the earliest human groups, survival depended on cooperation. A single individual could not hunt, protect, and nurture alone. The tribe was the organism. Belonging was oxygen. Every approving gesture, an offered meal, a shared fire, meant safety. Every rejection meant risk. Our ancestors, who were exquisitely sensitive to approval and disapproval, stayed close to the group and survived to pass on their genes. Their bodies, and ours, learned that connection equals life. What we call fear of judgment today is, at its deepest level, an evolutionary echo of that primal truth. Neuroscience maps this echo with precision. The moment we sense social acceptance, the brain releases oxytocin and dopamine. The heart slows, muscles soften. The vagus nerve, which links brain and body in a continuous loop of regulation, sends signals of calm through the chest and gut. When we perceive rejection or uncertainty, the opposite occurs. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream, preparing the body for defense. The ancient fight or flight machinery activates not against predators, but against silence, criticism, or the blank space of misunderstanding. Approval soothes because it literally stabilizes the body's internal weather. Disapproval hurts because it disrupts it. This biological design does not make us weak, it makes us human. Yet, as Jung observed, every adaptive pattern becomes problematic when it remains unconscious. When our search for approval operates beneath awareness, it begins to govern us. We explain ourselves compulsively, not because logic demands it, but because the body is chasing equilibrium. We apologize before there is conflict, elaborate before there is confusion, smile when we do not mean to, all in service of an invisible chemical need. To keep cortisol low and oxytocin high. Our words become a form of self-medication. Jung would have recognized this not as moral failure, but as misplaced psychic energy. Fear, he wrote, is a kind of energy that, when understood, can transform into insight. The biology of reassurance is, in this sense, the biology of potential transformation. Each moment of anxiety, each micro-surge of stress hormones when someone hesitates before replying, is the body signaling, there is something here to become conscious of. The task is not to repress the fear or override the biology, but to meet it with awareness. Imagine you are in conversation, and you sense the other person's attention slipping. Instantly, the body reacts. The pulse quickens, breath shallows, shoulders tense. Before the mind can interpret the event, the body has already moved to repair connection. You might explain your point again, soften your tone, or make a small joke to bring them back. But if you pause, even for 2 seconds, and feel the physical sensations directly, a small space opens. You notice that the fear is not proof of danger. It is a reflex from another time. In that noticing, the energy shifts from reaction to observation. You are no longer inside the fear. You are watching it. And that difference, though subtle, changes everything. From the perspective of the nervous system, such pauses are moments of retraining. Each time we remain still while the body trembles for reassurance, we teach it that connection can survive uncertainty. The prefrontal cortex sends inhibitory signals to the amygdala, softening the alarm. Gradually, the chemical loop of approval seeking begins to loosen. What was once an automatic reflex becomes a choice. This is not disconnection, it is regulation. The body learns a new rhythm, one in which peace originates within rather than arriving from outside. Jung described this inward shift as a movement of libido, not in the modern sexual sense, but as psychic energy that can flow outward into the world or inward toward meaning. When fear drives the flow outward, we seek safety through others. When awareness redirects it inward, the same energy fuels self-trust. The biology remains the same. What changes is its direction. Cortisol and adrenaline no longer signal catastrophe, but vitality. They become the pulse of awakening rather than panic. In Jung's language, the symptom transforms into symbol. Modern research echoes this transformation in different terms. Studies of mindfulness show that conscious breathing reduces sympathetic nervous activation, lowers heart rate variability, and increases parasympathetic tone, the physiological markers of calm. To breathe through fear, to stay present in disapproval, is to send a biological message of safety to the body. It is not about denying fear, but metabolizing it. In that sense, the body and psyche are partners. The body alerts us through tension, the psyche translates the message, and awareness integrates both into coherence. Over time, this integration changes how we relate to others. We begin to notice that much of what we called empathy was actually anxiety dressed in care. We over-explained not because we loved clarity, but because we feared being misread. We sought reassurance not to understand others, but to escape the tremor inside ourselves. As the biology calms, compassion becomes cleaner. We can listen without the need to correct our image. We can speak without anticipating how every word will land. The body no longer dictates the conversation. Presence does. This new stability is quiet, almost invisible from the outside. People might still misunderstand you, but it no longer shakes your core. The nervous system holds steady. The mind stays curious. Jung would call this the beginning of integration, the point where the energy of fear becomes the energy of meaning. The fear that once triggered justification now invites reflection. What am I protecting? What truth am I afraid to stand in? The moment fear becomes a question rather than a command, it starts to dissolve. In a world saturated with metrics of validation, likes, comments, ratings, grades, this biological awareness becomes a form of rebellion. To rest calmly in disapproval is to step outside the evolutionary script. It is to acknowledge that while our ancestors needed the tribe for survival, we now possess the capacity for internal security. Our biology may still whisper old instructions, but consciousness can choose how to respond. The nervous system can learn new rituals of reassurance, a breath, a pause, a simple sentence spoken without defense. Ultimately, the biology of reassurance is not about escaping fear, but about befriending it. The same body that trembles under scrutiny also softens under awareness. The same hormones that once governed survival can, when integrated, support presence. Fear ceases to be the enemy of peace and becomes its messenger. Jung would say that the energy of fear, once faced, turns into the energy of life itself. When we understand this, approval loses its spell. We no longer chase it as proof of worth, but receive it as one of many signals in the ongoing dialogue between self and world. Praise feels warm but no longer vital. Criticism stings but no longer wounds. Beneath both runs the steady pulse of self-regulation, the heartbeat of consciousness aware of itself. In that state, reassurance is no longer a transaction, but a state of being. The body, once addicted to external calm, discovers an internal rhythm that cannot be taken away. And this is where Jung's insight becomes biological truth. Fear is not the proof of weakness, but the proof that life is asking for expansion. To listen to it without obedience, to feel it without collapse, is to reclaim the very energy that built civilizations and families and friendships. It is to stand in the same body that once trembled for approval and realize that the tremor itself was the teacher. When you can feel that, when you can let the pulse of fear move through you without rushing to explain it away, you begin to sense what real safety feels like. Not the kind that depends on others' reassurance, but the kind that comes from your own steady presence in the middle of it all. Chapter 3. The Mirror Effect. There comes a moment, usually quiet and unremarkable, when we realize that much of what we see in others is not actually about them at all. We think we are observing, but we are reflecting. Every gesture we admire, every trait we resent, every piece of approval we crave, all of it is filtered through an invisible lens that bends the image back toward us. This is what Jung called projection, not in the narrow, clinical sense of attributing our own flaws to someone else, but as a fundamental psychological process by which the inner world reveals itself through the outer one. To live among other people is to live among mirrors, and until we learn to see that, we spend our lives mistaking reflections for reality. The need for approval is one of the clearest mirrors of all, because it doesn't merely show us who we are. It shows us who we fear we are not. When someone's validation lifts us, it is because we have placed a part of our worth in their hands, hoping to see it confirmed in their eyes. When their disapproval crushes us, it is because that same mirror reflects back the insecurity we were trying not to face. Jung believed that the psyche seeks wholeness through contrast, that whatever remains unconscious will appear outside of us until we are willing to recognize it within. In this way, every person we want to please is a messenger, carrying news from a hidden corner of our own self. We often imagine projection as something defensive, a trick of the mind that keeps us from seeing our darker sides. But there is another way to understand it, one that is less about distortion and more about revelation. Projection is how the inner world reaches out to become visible. The need for approval, when seen this way, is the psyche's attempt to draw attention to an unresolved relationship with self-worth. It is as if the unconscious were saying, "Look there," in that moment when your heart tightens, waiting for praise. Look at the part of you that still believes it must be seen to exist. The external mirror exists because the inner one is cracked. Biologically, this dynamic follows the same circuitry of reassurance explored earlier. When we seek validation, the brain's reward pathways activate in anticipation of acceptance, linking external approval with internal calm. Psychologically, however, that calm comes with a price: dependence. Each time we receive approval, we strengthen the neural and emotional bond between outer reflection and inner worth. Over time, our sense of identity becomes externally anchored. We no longer ask, "Who am I?" but "Who do they think I am?" The mirror dictates the self, and fear governs both. Jung would argue that this is a natural phase of development, necessary even, because consciousness is born through reflection. A child learns I through the recognition of others. The problem arises when this early mechanism never matures, when we remain caught in a lifelong feedback loop of seeking ourselves in the faces around us. The psyche, longing for balance, will use fear as a way to get our attention. Disapproval, rejection, misunderstanding. These become psychological wake-up calls, the moments when the mirror refuses to flatter us. When that happens, we often interpret the discomfort as proof that something is wrong with us, when in truth, it is an opportunity to reclaim what we have projected away. Imagine standing in front of a literal mirror that suddenly distorts your image. The instinct is to fix the glass, to adjust the lighting, to find a better reflection. In social life, we do the same. We change our words, our tone, our boundaries, all in an effort to restore a pleasing image. But Jung would suggest a different response. Rather than polishing the mirror, turn around. Look for the source of the distortion within. What is it in me that cannot stand to be misread? What part of me is still convinced that I must appear flawless to deserve acceptance? These questions do not have quick answers, but asking them begins to dissolve the reflex that drives approval seeking. The mirror's power diminishes as awareness grows. The science of perception offers an interesting parallel. What we see is never purely external. It is a composite of incoming light and internal expectation. The brain constructs vision by predicting patterns, filling in gaps, overlaying memory upon sensation. In a similar way, social perception is an act of prediction. We anticipate how others will see us and then behave accordingly, creating self-fulfilling reflections. The person who fears rejection unconsciously invites it through constant self-censorship. And the person who expects admiration may project confidence that draws it in. Our social mirrors reflect not truth, but probability, the likelihood that others will see what we already believe about ourselves. This is why awareness matters so deeply. Once we recognize that the mirror is interactive, that others respond as much to our own projected energy as to our actual behavior, the cycle of fear begins to loosen. Jung would call this reclaiming projection, bringing home the parts of ourselves we once outsourced to others' opinions. It is not an intellectual process, but an emotional one, a slow reabsorption of scattered energy. Each time we resist the impulse to chase approval, we draw back a fragment of power. Each time we let someone misunderstand us without panic, we retrieve another. Over time, the image in the mirror becomes less commanding because the self behind it has become more complete. This reclamation, however, requires courage. Jung wrote that nothing in the psyche comes to consciousness without pain. To see ourselves clearly, we must be willing to encounter both the flattering and the uncomfortable reflections. The people who trigger our need for approval are often the same ones who can teach us the most about our own fears. The colleague whose praise we crave, the friend whose opinion we dread, the stranger whose comment lingers too long. Each holds a small shard of our projected identity. When we notice the emotional charge they provoke, we can use it as a clue. The goal is not to stop caring about others, but to recognize when caring becomes dependency. To love is to relate. To depend is to dissolve. When we begin to internalize this understanding, the world subtly changes texture. Interactions feel less like tests and more like exchanges of energy. Approval and criticism lose their polarity. Both become information rather than judgment. Someone's admiration might illuminate the qualities you had disowned. Someone's disapproval might reveal where you still seek external confirmation. Either way, the mirror becomes a teacher rather than a trap. Jung might say that we move from projection to participation, from unconscious reflection to conscious relationship. In this state, fear does not vanish, it transforms. The same flutter in the chest that once drove you to over-explain now becomes a signal to pause and observe. Instead of rushing to control perception, you breathe into the uncertainty and let the moment unfold. The nervous system, once conditioned to panic at disconnection, learns to tolerate ambiguity. You realize that misunderstanding is not exile and that disapproval is not death. The body remembers calm even in the absence of applause. And as this new rhythm takes hold, something remarkable happens. The mirror stops defining you and starts reflecting your stability back to you. Ultimately, the mirror effect teaches that others are not here to confirm our identity, but to reveal its unfinished edges. Every encounter, every misunderstanding, every wave of fear that rises when approval wavers, all of it is part of the psyche's attempt to wake us from dependence on reflection. When we see this clearly, we begin to live differently. We no longer speak to impress, we speak to connect. We no longer listen to defend, we listen to understand. Approval, once the measure of safety, becomes simply one color in the spectrum of human exchange. Pleasant when it appears, unnecessary when it does not. Jung would remind us that wholeness is not achieved by perfecting the mirror, but by realizing that we were never merely its image. The need for approval dissolves not because we stop valuing connection, but because we finally understand where connection truly begins. In the quiet recognition that what we seek from others has always been waiting within us, reflected in every gaze, every silence, every fleeting moment of fear that asks to be seen not as failure, but as the threshold of self-knowledge. Chapter 4. Fear as a teacher, not an enemy. For most of us, fear arrives with a bad reputation. We experience its quickening pulse, its shallow breath, the way it tightens the body, and we rush to remove it. We distract, explain, numb, or argue with it. We tell ourselves we are being rational, that fear is a flaw, something to be managed or defeated. Yet, if we pause long enough to listen, not to the noise it makes on the surface, but to the deeper resonance beneath, we may begin to sense what Jung understood so profoundly, that fear is not a malfunction of the psyche, but one of its oldest teachers. It is the voice of the unknown trying to speak, the messenger announcing that something within us is ready to expand. Fear, as Jung saw it, is not merely emotional energy, it is psychic energy, the force that animates change. Everything alive resists transformation at first. The cell resists division, the seed resists breaking open, the psyche resists stepping beyond its old boundaries. Fear is the tension that arises in that resistance. It is the body's and mind's way of saying, we are approaching the edge of what we know. In that sense, fear is not the obstacle to growth. It is the threshold of it. Each time we feel afraid, we are standing at a frontier between what is familiar and what wants to become conscious. We often talk about fear as something that holds us back. But if we look closely, we see that it also points us forward. The topics we avoid, the conversations we postpone, the dreams we call unrealistic, these are usually the exact areas where transformation waits. Jung believed that the psyche has a kind of self-organizing intelligence, a directionality toward wholeness, and that fear emerges precisely where the ego resists that movement. To put it simply, fear is how the deeper self gets our attention. It is the flare sent up from the depths saying, something in you is unfinished. Something is calling for integration. Modern neuroscience gives this metaphor a biological echo. Fear, at its core, is not just a mental state, but a complex physiological symphony designed to keep us alert to possibility. The amygdala, often called the brain's alarm bell, lights up not only in danger, but in novelty, whenever we encounter the unfamiliar. In those moments, stress hormones surge to prepare us for action. What we interpret as anxiety may simply be the nervous system's way of mobilizing energy for discovery. When we run from fear, we misread its signal and waste its power. When we approach it with curiosity, that same energy becomes the fuel for insight. Jung's line, "Where your fear is, there is your task," is not a moral injunction, but a psychological map. It tells us that fear does not appear randomly. It localizes around the parts of life that matter most. The fear of being seen often hides the wish to express oneself more fully. The fear of failure conceals the longing to create. The fear of loss reflects the capacity for deep attachment. Fear points directly to potential. Its presence is evidence that something vital is unfolding. Its intensity is proportional to its importance. To live without fear would not be to live bravely, but to live half awake, untouched by the edges that define growth. To work with fear as a teacher requires a different posture of mind, not confrontation, but conversation. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this?" we might ask, "What is this trying to show me?" Jung often compared the psyche to nature. Both follow organic laws that cannot be rushed. Just as a plant bends toward light, the psyche bends toward wholeness. And fear is the feeling of that bending, the strain of the roots reaching through stone. When we resist it, we fracture. When we listen, the system reorganizes itself. Awareness becomes the sunlight that allows the new pattern to emerge. There is a paradox here. Fear feels like contraction, yet within it lies expansion. Think of how the body reacts when startled. The inhale, the tension, the moment of holding. But immediately after, if we allow it, comes the exhale, the release, the return to flow. Psychological fear follows the same rhythm. When we stop resisting, the energy locked inside fear begins to move. What once felt like paralysis becomes momentum. Jung saw this as the psyche's natural way of balancing itself. Every inhibition conceals its own opposite. Every blockage hides movement waiting to happen. The task is not to fight the contraction, but to stay conscious through it until it becomes release. When we start treating fear as information, life takes on a new texture. The moments that once felt unbearable become points of inquiry. The nervous conversation before a presentation, the tremor in the chest before honesty, the dread before change. These no longer seem like flaws to eliminate, but as signals of readiness. In facing them, we begin to realize that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to stay present within it. Jung noted that transformation rarely occurs in comfort. It requires tension between what we have been and what we are becoming. Fear, then, is the heat in which identity softens enough to be reshaped. To live in relationship with fear does not mean to romanticize suffering. It means to trust that anxiety and expansion are part of the same process. When fear arises, something is being asked of us, not necessarily to act, but to attend. We can observe the body's reactions, feel the heart accelerate, the breath shorten, and instead of labeling it as danger, recognize it as life in motion. Fear teaches presence by refusing to be ignored. It pulls attention into the moment, grounding us in the immediacy of experience. The very discomfort that makes us want to escape is also what anchors us in reality. This approach changes the way we relate to others as well. When we see fear as a teacher in ourselves, we begin to recognize it in those around us, hidden beneath anger, perfectionism, or detachment. We start to understand that behind most defensive behaviors lies the same tremor of vulnerability. Jung believed that empathy arises naturally when we accept our own complexity. The more gently we can hold our own fear, the less harshly we interpret the fear of others. Approval, criticism, misunderstanding, all become expressions of the same human struggle to stay safe in a changing world. If we follow this insight far enough, we reach a quiet truth. Fear's ultimate lesson is humility. It reminds us that we are finite creatures navigating an infinite field. It strips away illusion, exposing the limits of control. And in doing so, it invites a kind of faith, not in external authority, but in the process of life itself. Jung saw this faith not as religious belief, but as a psychological necessity, a trust that the psyche knows what it is doing even when we do not. To stand before fear without running is to participate in that wisdom. Eventually, something shifts. Fear no longer feels like an intruder. It becomes part of the conversation of being alive. The pulse quickens. The mind anticipates disaster. But beneath it, there is a second voice, calm, observant, almost kind, whispering, "This is growth arriving. Stay with it." And when we do, the energy that once terrified us becomes the same energy that propels us into authenticity. The need for approval softens because we no longer depend on others to calm the tremor within. We have learned to listen to it ourselves. That is the essence of fear's teaching. Not to make us fearless, but to make us conscious. Every time we meet fear without explanation, without disguise, we practice the art of staying awake in uncertainty. And in that wakefulness, life expands. What once felt like an enemy becomes a guide. What once felt like weakness becomes wisdom. And what once drove us to seek approval becomes the very path that leads us beyond it, into the quiet, steady confidence of simply being alive, afraid, and completely whole. Chapter 5: The Social Instinct and Its Trap. Human beings are creatures of connection long before they are creatures of reason. We are born into dependency, wired to interpret tone and gesture before we understand words, attuned to approval and belonging even before we can define them. From the moment an infant locks eyes with a caregiver, a neurological blueprint begins to form. Safety comes through recognition, calm through responsiveness, existence through being seen. This pattern is not cultural, it is biological, deeply ancient, and shared across the animal kingdom. Every pack, herd, and flock survives because its members stay in rhythm with one another. What began as an evolutionary advantage has, over time, evolved into a complex psychological instinct: the longing to belong and the fear of separation. Jung observed that much of what we call civilization is built upon this instinct, the collective drive to align with others, to participate in something larger than the individual self. He described the human psyche as a social organism as much as a personal one, structured around what he called the collective unconscious, the shared inheritance of symbols, archetypes, and behaviors that keep societies coherent. Yet, he also warned that what binds us can just as easily blind us. The same instinct that allows empathy and cooperation can become a trap when we mistake conformity for connection, when we confuse harmony with health. In those moments, the fear of standing apart begins to govern the psyche more powerfully than the desire for authenticity. If we listen closely, the social instinct speaks in subtle ways. It is the slight hesitation before expressing a controversial thought, the tightening in the chest when silence follows an opinion, the compulsion to soften truths so they will be received more gently. These impulses feel benign, even considerate, but beneath them lies a current of anxiety, an echo of our evolutionary past, whispering that exclusion means danger. The modern mind rarely sees how ancient this reflex is. In the tribes of prehistory, exile was a death sentence. To be separated from the group meant losing access to protection, food, and companionship. Our nervous system still interprets disapproval as a kind of social death. Cortisol floods, adrenaline spikes, and we feel an urgent need to restore the connection, even if it means betraying our own voice. This is the trap of the social instinct, that it disguises fear as virtue. We tell ourselves that we are being diplomatic, adaptable, or kind, when in truth, we are avoiding the discomfort of difference. Jung recognized this as one of the great paradoxes of psychological development. The same instinct that fosters unity can also prevent individuation. In a collective sense, this pattern gives rise to conformity. In a personal sense, it produces exhaustion. The person who constantly seeks approval lives in a state of divided attention, half in their own thoughts, half in the imagined reactions of others. Over time, the boundary between inner and outer blurs until they can no longer tell where their own beliefs end and where the collective begins. Modern psychology and neuroscience describe a similar mechanism. Social belonging activates the brain's reward circuitry, the same pathways triggered by physical warmth and nourishment. But chronic reliance on external validation reshapes these neural loops. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-regulation and decision-making, becomes subordinate to the social evaluation centers of the brain. In other words, the more we depend on approval for stability, the more we lose the capacity to generate it internally. The trap becomes chemical as well as emotional. We are caught in a feedback system that rewards conformity and punishes authenticity with the same neurotransmitters that once ensured survival. Jung's approach to this dilemma was not rebellion, but awareness. He believed that every instinct, no matter how primitive, contains intelligence. The task is not to suppress the social instinct, but to bring it into consciousness, to see it for what it is and decide when to follow and when to resist. This requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the capacity to stay between belonging and autonomy without collapsing into either. It means learning to bear the anxiety that comes from not being universally understood, to accept that genuine connection sometimes requires temporary isolation. The person who can do this, he wrote, becomes psychologically whole, not because they reject the group, but because they participate in it without being consumed by it. Consider how this dynamic plays out in everyday life. A person voices an unpopular opinion at work and feels the sudden chill of disapproval. The body tenses. The mind searches for repair strategies. Add context, soften tone, retreat. Yet if that person can stay with the discomfort, something subtle happens. Beneath the fear, a small spark of integrity begins to glow. The recognition that truth does not need unanimous consent to be real. This moment of stillness in the face of social tension is not defiance, it is evolution. The nervous system learns that disagreement is survivable, that disconnection does not equal annihilation. Gradually, the old tribal coding weakens, and a new form of belonging takes its place, one grounded in authenticity rather than compliance. Jung often noted that the individual who dares to stand apart from the collective becomes a vessel for renewal. History, he said, moves forward through those willing to disappoint their time in order to serve it. But this kind of independence does not emerge through arrogance or rebellion. It begins with a simple shift, from seeking permission to offering presence. To be present with others without the constant need to be validated by them is to hold a space where genuine dialogue can occur. Approval becomes less important than understanding, agreement less important than truth. In this way, individuation is not separation from society, but contribution to its maturity. This transformation requires patience, because the social instinct never fully disappears. It reappears each time we enter a new circle, start a new relationship, or share a vulnerable idea. The difference is that we learn to see it not as a dictator, but as an advisor, helpful, but not infallible. When it warns us of rejection, we can thank it for its vigilance and still move forward. When it urges silence to avoid conflict, we can pause, breathe, and decide whether the silence serves truth or fear. Jung would call this the emergence of consciousness. The moment instinct becomes choice. In the end, the social instinct is neither good nor bad. It is a force like gravity or hunger, shaping the orbit of human life. The danger lies only in mistaking its voice for our own. To live entirely for approval is to live as an echo, reverberating with the expectations of others. To live entirely without regard for others is to lose empathy and drift into isolation. Between these poles lies the delicate balance Jung devoted his life to describing, the dance between self and society, autonomy and attachment, individuality and belonging. The goal is not to escape the dance, but to learn its rhythm. When we finally begin to trust that rhythm, something extraordinary happens. The same instinct that once chained us to conformity becomes the ground for genuine connection. We find ourselves able to sit in disagreement without hostility, to offer kindness without fear, to speak our truth without trembling. The nervous system that once flinched at disapproval now hums with steadiness. We begin to see that belonging was never meant to demand the death of individuality. It was meant to express it, to weave many authentic voices into a single living harmony. And in that harmony, approval ceases to be a condition for safety. It becomes a natural side effect of being fully, consciously human. Chapter 6. The insecurity loop. There is a strange rhythm that governs much of modern life, one that hums quietly beneath the surface of even our most confident moments. It begins with a small tremor of doubt, an unspoken question about whether we are doing enough, giving enough, being enough. And before long, that tremor becomes movement. We reach out to check the responses, the comments, the eyes of others, seeking confirmation that our place in the world is still secure. And when that confirmation arrives, however briefly, the pulse slows, the mind softens, and a fleeting calm settles in. But the stillness never lasts long. Before we know it, another doubt arises, another need to explain or justify, another spiral of uncertainty. Jung might call this an archetype of repetition, the psyche caught in a loop, endlessly circling around a need it can never truly satisfy. This loop, fear, reassurance, relief, and then fear again, is not a personal flaw. It is a pattern deeply rooted in the way the human nervous system evolved to keep us alive. Approval releases small floods of neurochemicals, oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, each one a signal to the body that we are safe within the group. But the brain, built for vigilance, quickly adjusts its threshold. What once felt like comfort now feels like normality, and the absence of reassurance begins to register as danger again. The very system designed to protect us becomes the source of our unrest. It is a physiological paradox. The more we chase safety through reassurance, the more fragile safety becomes. Jung would see this not as pathology, but as invitation. Every cycle in the psyche, he observed, contains the possibility of transformation if we can bring awareness to it. The insecurity loop is no different. It is the psyche's way of alerting us that something essential is being sought in the wrong place, that the energy of self-trust has been projected outward onto the unpredictable landscape of others' reactions. Each loop is a message, not a malfunction. It says, "Look closer. You are searching for steadiness where steadiness cannot stay." To understand this loop fully, we have to trace its path from sensation to story. It usually begins in the body, a tightening in the chest, a faint unease in the stomach, an almost imperceptible flicker of threat. The mind, eager to explain, translates this physiological whisper into thought. They must be disappointed. I said too much. I should clarify. The thought, in turn, triggers behavior. The message, the apology, the over-explanation. And when the other person responds with kindness or affirmation, the body relaxes again. But only for a while. Because the loop was never about the content of the fear. It was about the mechanism itself. A system trained to treat uncertainty as danger. Until that mechanism is understood, the loop will always restart. Jung's approach was to watch these cycles with the same curiosity he brought to dreams. He believed that recurring emotional patterns were symbolic communications from the unconscious, using repetition as emphasis. In the case of the insecurity loop, the message is usually about misplaced authority. Somewhere along the way, the psyche has handed the keys of its self-worth to the external world. Each return of the loop is a reminder that those keys must be reclaimed. The goal is not to silence the need for approval, but to understand what it is pointing toward. The deeper longing to feel safe in one's own perception of reality. Breaking the loop, then, does not begin with control, but with observation. The next time you feel the tug to explain yourself or check for reassurance, pause. Feel the body's insistence, the pulse of anxiety, the tightening in the throat. Instead of rushing to satisfy it, watch it. Jung often wrote that emotion, when made conscious, becomes energy for transformation. The act of observing fear without immediately soothing it creates a small gap in the cycle, a space where new meaning can emerge. That gap is where freedom begins. Neuroscience now validates what Jung intuited through experience. When we become aware of an emotional impulse without acting on it, the prefrontal cortex begins to regulate the amygdala, quieting the automatic alarm. Over time, this practice rewires the brain's response to uncertainty. What once felt unbearable becomes tolerable, and what was tolerable becomes neutral. Each moment of awareness is a microscopic act of liberation, a quiet rewiring of centuries-old survival code. Yet awareness alone is not enough. It must be accompanied by compassion. The loop exists because it once worked. Somewhere in childhood, approval might have been the only available form of safety. The nervous system learned that reassurance equals love, and it carried that equation into adulthood. To simply break the loop without tenderness is to wage war on one's own history. Jung understood that the psyche grows through acceptance, not aggression. Healing begins when we can look at the loop and say, "Of course I do this. It once kept me alive." That acknowledgement transforms shame into understanding, and understanding into choice. As we practice this awareness, a gradual shift occurs. The loop no longer feels like a prison, but like a pulse, an ebb and flow of energy that no longer dictates behavior. Fear arises, but it is met with curiosity rather than panic. Approval still feels pleasant, but its absence no longer feels catastrophic. We begin to see that reassurance was never the destination. It was merely the map leading us back to the source of self-trust. Jung might say that the energy once spent chasing external safety becomes available for the work of inner integration, the uniting of thought, feeling, and instinct into a more stable whole. The beauty of this transformation lies in its subtlety. It doesn't announce itself with grand moments of enlightenment. It shows up in small, nearly invisible gestures. The unreturned message that no longer spirals into worry. The disagreement that no longer demands reconciliation. The quiet sense of worth that remains even when no one is watching. These are signs that the loop has begun to lose its grip, that the psyche has reclaimed its rhythm. The nervous system, once bound to the external tempo of approval, learns to dance to its own internal music. Still, the loop never disappears entirely. Like all instincts, it remains part of our psychic ecology, ready to re-emerge when life feels uncertain. Jung would remind us that the goal is not eradication, but relationship. To live consciously is to stay in dialogue with our patterns rather than being ruled by them. When the familiar unease returns, we can greet it like an old companion. "Ah, you again. What are you trying to show me this time?" In that conversation, fear loses its authority and becomes what it was always meant to be: information. Eventually, what once felt like insecurity transforms into sensitivity, a fine-tuned awareness of the emotional field between self and world. This awareness no longer feeds the loop, but enriches it. We can sense others' moods without absorbing them, understand misunderstanding without rushing to fix it, offer explanation only when it serves clarity rather than fear. The same energy that once drove us to seek approval becomes the energy that allows us to connect without dependence. It is the same current, redirected inward and then outward again, cleaner, steadier, freer. This is the quiet end of the insecurity loop, not its destruction, but its transcendence. Jung might describe it as the point where the psyche stops circling its wound and begins to orbit its center. The fear of disapproval remains, but it no longer commands obedience. The body still trembles sometimes, but the trembling no longer dictates action. You stand inside the same human fragility that once sent you chasing reassurance, and you find that it no longer frightens you. The loop becomes a rhythm. The rhythm becomes awareness, and awareness becomes peace. In that peace, explanation falls away, and what remains is presence, calm, unhurried, and whole. Chapter 7, The Silence Test. Silence is one of the simplest and most unsettling experiences we can encounter. In conversation, it stretches time, thickens the air, and exposes the hidden architecture of our inner world. A pause after we speak can feel like judgment. An unanswered message can pulse like rejection. Most of us rush to fill these spaces with words, with apologies, with explanations, because silence awakens an ancient fear, the fear of being unseen. Jung might say that in these moments, we are not really afraid of silence itself, but of what silence reveals, the absence of confirmation, the uncertainty of our place in the minds of others. Yet, if we look more closely, silence is not absence at all. It is a mirror of our dependence on noise for reassurance, an opportunity to witness how much of our identity still relies on being echoed by others. The need to explain ourselves is, in many ways, the avoidance of silence. We speak to prevent the discomfort of not being understood, to rescue ourselves from the unease of unspoken assumptions. But silence, when we stop fearing it, becomes one of the most honest teachers of self-awareness. It shows us how our mind fills the void with projections and stories. When someone pauses too long before responding, we imagine disapproval. When a friend grows quiet, we invent distance. When an audience listens without reaction, we sense failure. The silence itself is neutral, but the meanings we assign to it reveal the architecture of our fears. Jung believed that psychic growth begins at this very point, when we can hold tension without rushing to resolve it. Silence is that tension, distilled into soundless form. The biology of this discomfort is ancient. Human beings evolved to communicate continuously, not only through language but through subtle signals of gaze, tone, and rhythm. Every conversation carries its own physiological harmony, a synchrony of heartbeats and micro-expressions that keeps the social nervous system regulated. When the flow of signals breaks, the body senses a kind of danger. Cortisol rises, attention sharpens, and we instinctively move to restore the lost connection. The urge to speak, to clarify, to explain, is often the nervous system's way of re-establishing synchrony. It is less about meaning than about safety. Jung would call this a kind of archetypal inheritance, the deep memory of the tribe, in which silence could mean threat, exile, or the loss of belonging. The task of modern consciousness he might say, is to re-educate this reflex, to learn that silence can be not only safe, but sacred. The silence test, then, is the moment when we choose to remain still despite the rising tide of anxiety. It is the decision not to explain ourselves when every cell of the body urges us to do so. The first time we try this, the experience feels unbearable. Time slows, the body hums with discomfort, and the mind spins stories of what the other person must be thinking. But beneath the noise, something else begins to happen. We start to notice the separation between what is actually occurring and what we imagine. The other person's expression remains the same, only our interpretation changes. This is the first crack in the loop of fear, the realization that much of our distress arises not from what others do, but from what we project onto their silence. Jung often described the process of growth as a movement toward psychological wholeness, in which opposites are held in tension until a new synthesis emerges. Silence represents one of those opposites, the counterpoint to explanation, the negative space that gives shape to expression. To sit in silence without collapsing into self-doubt is to integrate a missing element of the psyche, the capacity to contain ambiguity. In the beginning, this feels like losing control, but in truth, it is the restoration of balance. We begin to sense that understanding does not have to be constant to be real, that communication is not broken by stillness, but deepened through it. Silence, once feared as rejection, becomes a space of listening, not just to others, but to ourselves. In this stillness, something remarkable occurs. The nervous system, once so dependent on external feedback, begins to find its own rhythm. The breath steadies, the pulse softens, and a new kind of calm arises. Not the fragile calm of reassurance, but the grounded calm of self-trust. This is the moment Jung would recognize as individuation in practice, the withdrawal of psychic energy from its external attachments and its return to the center. The silence test is not about endurance, but about recognition. It teaches that what feels like emptiness is actually fullness, a fullness of potential, of space, of awareness. When we stop trying to manage how others perceive us, our attention returns to the immediate reality of being. In that reality, nothing is missing. To live comfortably with silence is to develop a new relationship with time. Most of our anxiety arises from trying to control outcomes before they unfold. Silence, by contrast, suspends control. It places us in the present without resolution, forcing us to feel the stretch of uncertainty. Jung believed that this confrontation with the unknown is essential to transformation. Fear lives in the future, but growth happens only now. Silence, by refusing to move forward, pulls us back to the moment where real change occurs. In that stillness, the mind begins to reorganize itself. What once felt unbearable becomes meditative. What once triggered fear becomes an invitation to presence. There is, however, a difference between chosen silence and imposed silence. The first empowers, the second wounds. Jung would remind us that silence becomes meaningful only when it is conscious. To choose silence is to withhold reaction in order to listen. To be silenced, however, is to be denied participation. The difference lies in agency. When we claim silence as a deliberate act, it transforms from passivity into power. It allows us to observe without defending, to reflect without retreating. We begin to understand that not every misunderstanding needs correction. Not every discomfort requires repair. The mind learns patience, and patience is the soil of wisdom. This capacity for inner quiet gradually reshapes the way we relate to others. We start to hear beneath their words, to sense the emotions carried in pauses rather than statements. Empathy becomes less about response and more about presence. When someone else falls silent, we no longer rush to rescue them from their own discomfort. We can sit together in that space, breathing the same quiet air, letting meaning emerge organically. Jung would say, this is the beginning of true relationship, not a performance of constant affirmation, but a meeting of two consciousnesses that can coexist without the need to merge or dominate. In this state, silence becomes more than absence. It becomes language. It communicates respect, containment, and maturity. It signals that we have learned to hold both our own reactions and the reactions of others without collapsing under their weight. This is psychological adulthood, the point at which the need for approval no longer drives speech. We speak because we have something to say, not because we need to be validated for saying it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can say is nothing at all. When we reach this understanding, the silence test no longer feels like a test. It becomes a way of being. The same pause that once made us panic now feels like breathing space. The same unanswered message that once burned in our chest now feels like freedom. The same lack of applause that once felt like failure now feels irrelevant. What remains is a profound stillness, not the stillness of withdrawal, but of rootedness. Jung would describe this as the return of psychic balance, when energy that once scattered outward to seek approval gathers back into the center of being. From this center, silence is not emptiness. It is presence in its purest form. ChatGPT deny. Chapter 8. The weight of judgment. There is a moment we all recognize, when the gaze of another person lingers just a second too long, when a tone in their voice sharpens slightly, when a message arrives without warmth, and the body reacts before thought begins. The chest tightens, the breath shallows, the stomach twists in that precise, wordless way that signals you are being judged. It is astonishing how immediate and physical this reaction can be. The judgment itself may be real or imagined, harsh or subtle, yet its weight lands with the same density. Jung understood this sensation not as mere sensitivity, but as a clue to how deeply intertwined our sense of identity is with the opinions of others. To feel judged is to feel our reflection crack. It is to be reminded of how precariously we balance between who we believe ourselves to be and how we are perceived. From the beginning of life, our sense of self develops through mirrors held by others, the approving faces that soothe us, the disapproving ones that sting. Each glance becomes a data point in the story of who we think we are. Over years, this story hardens into identity, but its foundation remains relational. The human brain evolved to track social signals with the same vigilance once reserved for predators and storms. A raised eyebrow or a tone of disappointment activates the same neural circuitry that early humans used to detect threats to survival. Judgment feels heavy because deep in our biology, it is coded as danger. To lose standing in the tribe once meant losing protection, resources, and belonging. Even in the modern world, our nervous system carries that ancient memory forward. Jung saw judgment as one of the great shapers of the psyche, because every external criticism awakens an internal chorus of responses, memories, complexes, and fears that lie dormant until triggered. He wrote that our reactions to others' opinions reveal the unexamined parts of ourselves. If someone's disapproval devastates us, it is often because it echoes something we secretly believe. The external judge merely gives voice to an internal one that has been whispering all along. In that sense, judgment is never only about the other person. It is about the constellation of emotions it stirs within us: shame, resentment, defensiveness, or submission. Each one a messenger carrying information about the boundaries of our self-worth. The tragedy of living for approval is that it transforms judgment into a weapon we hand willingly to others. When our sense of value depends on being seen as competent, kind, or intelligent, every glance of disapproval feels like an existential threat. We begin to curate our lives around avoidance, choosing words that will not offend, ambitions that will not threaten, truths that will not disrupt. The psyche, once expansive, becomes cautious. Jung warned that what we repress externally will return internally as restlessness or despair. The fear of judgment, left unexamined, turns into an inner censor more punishing than any real critic could be. Yet paradoxically, it is through judgment that the opportunity for self-knowledge arises. Jung believed that life continually presents us with mirrors, some flattering, some distorted, so that we may come to know the full range of who we are. The discomfort of being judged is not only pain, it is information. It points directly to the places where our identity is still fragile, where we have not yet built inner stability. When a comment pierces too deeply, it marks a boundary we have not yet secured. Instead of defending ourselves against every perceived criticism, we can ask, why does this particular judgment hurt? What image of myself is it threatening? These questions turn pain into curiosity, transforming the heavy stone of judgment into a tool of awareness. In biological terms, this transformation mirrors the way the brain learns from stress. A small, tolerable amount of pressure activates growth, new neural pathways, increased resilience, deeper understanding. Similarly, psychological judgment, when faced consciously, can strengthen our sense of self. The key lies in regulation. When the body reacts to criticism, the amygdala floods the system with alarm, but conscious breathing, reflection, and grounding calm the storm. In that moment of equilibrium, we can discern what part of the judgment belongs to us and what does not. Jung often emphasized this separation, to take responsibility for what is true while refusing to carry what is not. To do so is to reclaim authorship over one's own narrative. There is a quiet kind of freedom that emerges from this practice. When we no longer collapse under the weight of judgment, we begin to perceive others' opinions differently. They become perspectives rather than verdicts. A harsh comment may still sting, but it no longer defines. A misunderstanding may still ache, but it no longer unravels the fabric of our self-worth. Jung would say that the ego, once rigid and reactive, becomes porous yet strong, open enough to absorb feedback, solid enough to remain intact. We can meet criticism with curiosity, knowing that to be seen differently is not to be diminished, but expanded. This change also alters how we judge others. Once we understand the pain of being seen through a narrow lens, our own lenses widen. We start to recognize that judgment is often fear in disguise. Fear of difference, fear of inadequacy, fear of the unknown. Jung believed that projection operates not only in admiration, but in condemnation. What we dislike in others often reflects something disowned in ourselves. To notice this does not excuse cruelty, but reveals its roots. Each time we catch ourselves judging, we can pause and ask what unacknowledged quality we are encountering. In that pause, compassion begins. Not sentimental pity, but the deep understanding that everyone, in their own way, is wrestling with the weight of being seen. Perhaps the most profound shift occurs when we realize that judgment, both given and received, loses its grip the moment we stop resisting it. The fear of judgment thrives on avoidance. It feeds on our efforts to appear flawless. When we allow ourselves to be seen as imperfect, not performatively, but sincerely, we disarm it. The critic loses power when there is nothing left to protect. Jung spoke of this as the movement toward integration, the acceptance of both light and shadow as part of a single whole. To stand in that wholeness is to live without needing to edit oneself for approval or armor oneself against rejection. It is the quiet confidence that says, yes, I am this, and also that. I contain contradictions, and I am still complete. In daily life, this looks ordinary yet feels revolutionary. It is the moment you speak honestly in a meeting and survive the silence that follows. It is choosing not to apologize for existing differently, not to soften your truth for comfort. It is the realization that you can hold your own gaze in the mirror even when others look away. The nervous system, once conditioned to equate judgment with danger, learns a new language, the language of neutrality. Fear transforms into information, tension into awareness, vulnerability into strength. The same sensations that once triggered defense now signal awakening. You begin to see that judgment at its core is simply feedback from the world, sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted, and that your task is not to erase it, but to understand what it shows you about your own resilience. In the end, the weight of judgment does not disappear, it redistributes. Instead of pressing down upon you, it settles evenly across the psyche, grounding rather than crushing. You still feel the glances, the words, the silences, but they no longer determine your direction. Jung would call this the moment of integration, when the inner center becomes strong enough to carry outer contradictions without imbalance. To live this way is not to become indifferent, but to become deeply alive within uncertainty. You listen, you feel, you stay open, and through it all, you remain rooted in a self no longer defined by approval or shaken by disapproval. The world still watches, but its gaze no longer decides who you are. Chapter 9. Fear and the Unknown Self. There is a threshold within each of us that we cross again and again, often without knowing it. It is the moment when something unfamiliar begins to stir, a thought that challenges our habits, a feeling that contradicts what we believe we should feel, an impulse that seems to belong to someone else. We sense it, hesitate, and then retreat. Beneath the retreat is fear, not of danger in the ordinary sense, but of encountering a version of ourselves that does not fit the image we have so carefully constructed. Jung understood this boundary intimately. He believed that the psyche is vast, that consciousness is but a small island floating in an ocean of the unknown self, and that our deepest fears arise not from what is outside of us, but from what remains undiscovered within. To meet the unknown self is to face uncertainty in its most personal form. It is not the uncertainty of the world, not economic insecurity, or political unrest, or environmental threat, but the uncertainty of one's own depths. It is the tremor that comes when we realize that the person we have been is only a fraction of who we are capable of being. Jung called this the process of individuation, the lifelong unfolding of the self through encounters with the unconscious. The unknown self, he said, is not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be integrated, a source of vitality, creativity, and wisdom that waits behind the walls of fear. Yet the approach is never easy, because every expansion of awareness feels, at first, like death to the ego that guards the known territory. Biologically, fear of the unknown is rooted in our survival systems. The brain evolved to favor predictability. Familiarity meant safety. When we face something new, a dark forest, an unfamiliar face, an untested idea, the amygdala fires a signal of caution. In ancient times, this reflex kept us alive. But in psychological life, the same circuitry becomes a barrier to growth. The nervous system cannot distinguish between an external predator and an internal revelation. Both trigger the same chemistry: adrenaline, tension, alertness. What we call resistance is often just the body protecting the mind from change. Jung would argue that the psyche, too, has its immune system, patterns of defense that maintain stability, even at the cost of possibility. The unknown self appears in many disguises. Sometimes it comes as a recurring dream, an emotion we cannot explain, or a creative impulse that feels irrational. Sometimes it takes the form of a person who provokes us, someone we dislike without reason, whose qualities seem alien yet strangely magnetic. Jung noted that we are drawn to the people who embody what we have not yet integrated. They act as mirrors for the parts of ourselves that we have pushed aside. The discomfort we feel around them is not about them at all. It is about the collision between the known and the unknown within us. Fear, in this context, becomes a signal of proximity, a sign that we are nearing something important, something that wants to be recognized. This is why avoidance never brings peace. When we turn away from what frightens us, we do not escape it. We internalize it. The energy of the unknown does not disappear. It seeps into dreams, relationships, and moods. It becomes anxiety without name, irritation without cause, exhaustion without rest. Jung observed that what we refuse to face in consciousness will emerge in life as fate. The external conflicts we attract often mirror the inner ones we deny. To break this cycle, we must learn to approach fear not as a warning to retreat, but as an invitation to dialogue. The unknown self does not demand obedience. It asks for curiosity. The first step in this dialogue is attention. When fear arises, instead of labeling it as weakness or failure, we can treat it as information. What is this fear pointing toward? What idea, emotion, or truth have I not allowed myself to explore? This questioning transforms fear from paralysis into movement. Jung described this process as turning toward the unconscious, the deliberate act of allowing what has been hidden to come into view. It requires patience because the psyche reveals itself in fragments and symbols, not in linear explanation. The unknown speaks through images, sensations, and coincidences. It must be listened to, not dissected. This turning inward is often accompanied by solitude. The path toward the unknown self cannot be crowded. External noise drowns out the faint signals of the inner world. At first, this solitude can feel like loss, the withdrawal from the familiar rhythms of validation and social affirmation. But gradually, silence becomes a vessel rather than a void. The nervous system, freed from constant social feedback, begins to recalibrate. The same circuits once tuned to others' approval now tune inward, sensing subtler harmonies, intuition, imagination, and the quiet intelligence of instinct. Jung considered this shift a sign of psychic maturity, the moment when the source of guidance moves from outer authority to inner alignment. Yet this journey is not without peril. The unknown self holds not only creativity, but chaos. To explore it carelessly is to risk confusion or inflation, mistaking every impulse for revelation, every emotion for truth. Jung warned that integration requires both courage and discrimination. Fear protects us not only from growth, but also from disintegration. Its purpose is to slow us down, to make us conscious. When we meet fear with awareness rather than avoidance, we can use it as a compass. It points not simply to what is dangerous, but to what is alive. The challenge is to distinguish between the fear that warns of harm and the fear that signals potential. The former asks for caution, the latter asks for attention. Over time, as we practice this discernment, the landscape of the psyche begins to change. The unknown no longer feels like an abyss, but like a horizon. What once frightened us becomes familiar. What was once hidden becomes integrated. The self expands, not by eliminating fear, but by learning to move within it. Jung described this as the paradox of transformation. That wholeness is achieved not by perfection, but by inclusion, by allowing contradiction and complexity to coexist. The unknown self, once feared as other, becomes part of the living totality of who we are. This transformation also reshapes our relationship to others. When we make peace with the unknown within ourselves, we become less reactive to the unknown in others. Difference no longer feels threatening. It feels enriching. The same curiosity we bring to our own depths extends outward into the world. Jung believed that this was the foundation of empathy, the recognition that each person carries their own undiscovered continents, their own fears, their own untamed potential. To honor that is to honor life itself. Ultimately, the encounter with the unknown self is a return home. Fear, once seen as the gatekeeper of darkness, becomes the guardian of transformation. Each time we cross the threshold of discomfort, we reclaim a fragment of ourselves that had been waiting in the shadows. The process is endless, for the psyche is boundless. Jung wrote that we are not meant to solve the mystery of who we are, only to deepen our relationship with it. To live this way is to accept that fear will always accompany discovery, that uncertainty is not failure, but evidence of aliveness. And as we learn to walk through that uncertainty, eyes open, heart steady, unhurried, we realize that the unknown self was never a stranger at all. It was simply the part of us that had been waiting to be welcomed back into the light. Chapter 10. The Myth of Selflessness. From the time we are young, many of us are taught that goodness lies in selflessness. We are praised for being accommodating, gentle, agreeable, and generous. We learn to give, to listen, to place others' needs before our own. Somewhere along the way, this becomes not just behavior, but identity, a quiet rule that governs the psyche. To be good is to be selfless. Yet Jung would have seen in this a subtle danger, because when selflessness becomes an ideal rather than an instinct, it begins to hollow out the self it was meant to ennoble. What appears as virtue on the surface can conceal fear beneath. The fear of being selfish, the fear of being rejected, the fear of disappointing those whose approval sustains our sense of worth. The myth of selflessness arises from a misunderstanding of balance. True compassion, Jung might say, is born from wholeness, not from absence. To give fully, one must possess something to give. To love deeply, one must know oneself deeply. But when we are conditioned to erase ourselves in the name of goodness, our giving becomes a form of survival. We say yes when we mean no. We volunteer when we are exhausted. We agree when we disagree, not out of generosity, but out of fear of losing connection. What masquerades as altruism is often appeasement, a quiet transaction that trades authenticity for belonging. In this way, the myth of selflessness binds us to the endless loop of external approval, the very pattern Jung spent his life urging humanity to outgrow. The roots of this myth are both cultural and biological. Our species thrived on cooperation. Social harmony ensured survival. The impulse to help others is woven into our nervous system, releasing oxytocin and endorphins that reward care and affiliation. But as societies grew more complex, this cooperative instinct hardened into moral expectation. Religions, traditions, and social systems exalted sacrifice as the highest good. To serve others was divine. To serve oneself was sin. Over centuries, the instinct for empathy was moralized into a commandment. And while the intention was noble, to temper greed and cruelty, it also bred guilt around the simple act of self-preservation. The body's natural signals for rest, boundaries, and autonomy were reinterpreted as selfishness. Jung saw this repression as a source of inner fragmentation because the psyche cannot thrive when half of its needs are silenced. To understand why this myth persists, we must look at the psychology of identity. The image of being selfless provides an external anchor, a way to secure approval, admiration, even love. The selfless person is rewarded socially for their compliance, and this reward system becomes addictive. Each act of overgiving produces a momentary feeling of worth, like a breath of warm air in winter. But because the act is driven by fear rather than authenticity, the warmth fades quickly. What remains is depletion, a quiet resentment toward those we serve, and a deeper resentment toward ourselves for never being able to say no. Jung would interpret this as a loss of psychic energy, a dissipation of vitality caused by chronic denial of the instinctual self. Fear hides behind this selflessness. Fear of confrontation, of being disliked, of being seen as unkind. The psyche, striving for acceptance, constructs an identity around avoidance. We become peacekeepers in other people's stories, believing that harmony means silence. Yet, true harmony, Jung would remind us, arises not from suppression, but from integration, from allowing both kindness and honesty to coexist. The person who cannot assert themselves for fear of seeming selfish lives in a split state, outwardly calm but inwardly divided. And it is precisely this division that breeds exhaustion, because to maintain constant self-erasure requires enormous psychic effort. Breaking this pattern begins not with rebellion, but with awareness. The next time we feel compelled to agree when we want to decline, we can pause and ask, am I acting from love or from fear? This question cuts to the heart of Jung's approach, the movement from unconscious compulsion to conscious choice. If the impulse to help arises from genuine empathy, it nourishes both giver and receiver. But if it arises from anxiety, it drains vitality. The same action, viewed through awareness, changes meaning entirely. Jung might call this the moment of transformation, when we stop performing goodness and start embodying it. The body itself offers clues to this distinction. When generosity is authentic, the breath feels open, the muscles relaxed. When it is forced, the body tightens, signaling an inner no that we override. Learning to read these signals is a form of psychological literacy. Jung often emphasized the wisdom of the body as a reflection of the unconscious. Our discomfort is not betrayal, it is communication. Each time we ignore it in the name of being selfless, we silence a part of ourselves that holds truth. The task is not to silence that part further, but to bring it into dialogue, to ask what it needs, what boundary it wishes to draw, what rest it is asking for. This conversation with the self transforms fear into compassion. We begin to understand that saying no is not cruelty, but clarity. To honor one's own limits is not to withdraw from humanity, but to join it with honesty. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires this balance. To be able to serve without losing oneself, to love without dissolving into the other. Wholeness, he wrote, is not saintly perfection, but the ability to contain opposites. In this light, the myth of selflessness begins to dissolve. The ideal of erasing oneself gives way to the reality of being fully human, imperfect, generous, and aware. There is a quiet liberation in this understanding. When we act from wholeness, giving no longer depletes us. The energy once trapped in fear becomes available for genuine connection. Relationships shift subtly. Resentment fades. Authenticity deepens. Boundaries become less about defense and more about rhythm. We start to sense when to give and when to rest, when to speak and when to listen. Jung would describe this as the return of psychic equilibrium, the self restoring its natural balance between inner and outer life. In time, what once felt like selfishness begins to feel like sincerity. We realize that caring for ourselves is not a betrayal of others, but a precondition for meaningful care. The approval we once sought through self-erasure is replaced by quiet confidence, not the loud certainty of ego, but the steady presence of authenticity. We no longer need to prove our goodness because we have redefined it. Goodness is no longer measured by how much of ourselves we give away, but by how truthfully we live within our own limits. The myth of selflessness ends not in defiance, but in understanding. It reveals that the truest form of service is not sacrifice, but wholeness. A self so grounded that its giving flows effortlessly, without resentment or depletion. Jung might say that such a person becomes a vessel through which life itself gives. Their actions arise not from fear of disapproval, but from alignment with the deeper order of being. And in that state, the need for approval falls away entirely, because the source of value is no longer external. It is found in the quiet knowing that to honor oneself is, at the deepest level, to honor the life that moves through all things. When we live this truth, generosity ceases to be performance. It becomes expression, the natural overflow of a self that is full, conscious, and free. And the world, sensing the difference, responds not with applause but with resonance. In that resonance, connection returns to its rightful place, not as a measure of worth, but as the meeting of two whole beings, each giving not from emptiness, but from the endless abundance of being fully alive. Chapter 11, Conflict as Growth. To many of us, conflict feels like failure, a fracture in harmony, a disruption of belonging, a sign that something has gone wrong. We equate peace with agreement and disagreement with danger. But Jung saw conflict differently. He believed that conflict, whether between people or within the psyche itself, is not a mistake in the human experience but a mechanism of evolution. It is the friction through which consciousness sharpens, the tension that forces hidden truths into the open. Without conflict, nothing grows, because growth requires difference, the meeting of opposing energies that generates transformation. The avoidance of conflict, like the avoidance of fear, often masquerades as virtue. We call it kindness, diplomacy, balance. Yet beneath that restraint, anxiety often hides, the same ancient fear of disapproval that shapes so much of human behavior. From childhood, many of us learn that to disagree is to risk rejection, that love and approval depend on compliance. And so we learn to soften our truths, to stay quiet in discomfort, to patch over tension with politeness. In doing so, we preserve short-term peace but sacrifice long-term integrity. Jung would argue that this suppression comes at a psychic cost, because the energy we use to maintain false harmony does not disappear. It turns inward, fermenting into resentment or despair. What we refuse to express outwardly becomes conflict within. In Jung's psychology, opposites are the engines of growth. Every living system, he believed, develops through the struggle between contradiction, light and dark, reason and emotion, self and other. The psyche seeks equilibrium, but that equilibrium is dynamic, not static. It depends on movement between polarities. When two opposing forces meet, an idea that challenges belief, a desire that contradicts duty, a relationship that tests our patience, the tension they create can feel unbearable. But within that tension lies energy. If we can stay conscious through it, not collapsing into one side or the other, a new synthesis emerges, a higher form that includes both opposites. Jung called this process the transcendent function, the psychological alchemy through which conflict becomes creativity. The same principle applies to human relationships. Two people cannot meet deeply without revealing their differences. True intimacy is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to navigate it without losing empathy. When we suppress disagreement for the sake of harmony, we limit connection to its most superficial layer, politeness. It is only when tension arises that we discover the edges of one another's worlds, the contours of belief and emotion that define individuality. To stay in that space, not to dominate or submit, but to remain present, is to participate in the real work of relationship. Jung would describe this as a moral act, the willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of truth. Biologically, the experience of conflict activates the same stress responses as physical threat. The heart rate rises, adrenaline floods, the body prepares to defend or flee. This is why conflict feels so primal, because it is. Yet neuroscience also shows that when we regulate through the tension, through breath, empathy, and awareness, new neural pathways form, linking emotional and cognitive regions of the brain. The capacity to stay present in disagreement literally rewires us for resilience. What begins as confrontation becomes integration, both within the brain and within the psyche. Jung intuited this long before modern science confirmed it. He saw conflict not as pathology, but as dialogue between parts of the self, a conversation that, if sustained, leads to expansion. To work with conflict consciously requires a shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "How can I end this tension?" we ask, "What is this tension trying to teach me?" This is not an invitation to dwell in chaos, but to look for meaning. Every disagreement points to a value that matters, a boundary that has been crossed, a need that has been ignored. If we listen without defensiveness, conflict reveals the deeper architecture of our psyche, the structures that define who we are and what we stand for. Jung might say that through conflict, the unconscious speaks. The discomfort we feel is not punishment, but communication, a summons to awareness. Most people experience two main reactions to conflict: domination or withdrawal. We either impose our view to silence discomfort, or we retreat to avoid it altogether. Both strategies deny the transformative potential of the encounter. The first turns difference into conquest. The second turns it into repression. The third way, the conscious way, is dialogue. To engage in dialogue is to hold one's truth without violence, and to hear another's truth without collapse. It is to trust that understanding can emerge from uncertainty. Jung believed that this capacity for dialogue mirrors the inner process of individuation. Just as we reconcile contradictions within ourselves, we learn to reconcile them in the world. In the internal landscape, conflict often takes subtler forms. We experience it as indecision, guilt, restlessness, the feeling of being torn between incompatible desires or duties. These inner tensions are not signs of weakness, but invitations to depth. The person who claims to be entirely at peace has often stopped listening. Real peace, Jung would argue, comes not from the absence of conflict, but from the presence of consciousness. When we can hold two opposing truths without denying either, the psyche matures. This inner tolerance for contradiction reflects outwardly as empathy and humility. The less we fear conflict within, the less we need to control it without. Consider, for instance, the tension between independence and belonging. Both are essential, yet they pull in opposite directions. Too much independence, and we drift into isolation. Too much belonging, and we dissolve into conformity. The balance between them is not fixed. It must be rediscovered continuously through experience, through conflict. Each disagreement we face in life, whether in relationships, communities, or within our own hearts, becomes an opportunity to recalibrate this balance. Jung saw such recalibration as the essence of the human journey, the endless movement between unity and differentiation, between the need for others and the need to be oneself. Over time, as we learn to inhabit this rhythm, conflict loses its sting. It still challenges, but it no longer threatens identity. We begin to sense that truth is not a possession to defend, but a field to explore. Disagreement becomes dialogue, tension becomes curiosity, and the old fear of disapproval begins to fade. The nervous system, once conditioned to equate conflict with danger, learns a new pattern. Tension can exist without rupture. Difference can coexist with love. Jung would describe this as the birth of inner authority, the point at which our sense of rightness comes not from agreement, but from authenticity. Eventually, we come to see that conflict, like fear, is not the opposite of harmony, but its precondition. Harmony without contrast is monotony. Peace without difference is stagnation. The music of life depends on dissonance resolving into new chords. Every time we face conflict consciously, we participate in that music, not as victims of tension, but as its composers. The process is rarely comfortable, but it is profoundly creative. Each clash of opposites, each difficult conversation, each internal struggle refines us. It carves depth into character and brings hidden dimensions of the self into light. When we finally understand this, conflict loses its reputation as the enemy of peace. It becomes a teacher, a sculptor, an instrument of evolution. To live without it would be to live without growth. Jung's psychology, at its core, is not about comfort, but about wholeness. And wholeness requires friction. The next time conflict arises, whether between your ideals and your impulses, your truth and another's, remember that the discomfort you feel is not a sign of failure, but of life trying to expand. Stay present. Listen. Let the tension do its work. Out of its fire, something new and stronger will always emerge. Not the end of peace, but its beginning in a deeper, more enduring form. Chapter 12. The courage to disappoint. There is a quiet kind of courage that rarely gets celebrated. Not the courage to confront enemies, scale mountains, or stand before crowds, but the courage to disappoint. It is the bravery of letting someone down when pleasing them would mean betraying yourself. The strength to be misunderstood rather than false. The grace to choose honesty over harmony. For Jung, this courage was not rebellion, but necessity. Individuation, the process of becoming whole, demands that we withdraw some of the energy we have invested in others' expectations and bring it home to the self. To grow into who we truly are is to accept that some people will not understand, approve, or applaud. The act of disappointing others, when done consciously, is not cruelty. It is a declaration of integrity. Most of us learn early that approval is the currency of belonging. A child senses disapproval as a withdrawal of warmth, a subtle but unmistakable chill. To avoid that chill, we adapt. We learn which parts of ourselves are welcomed and which are not. We learn to smile when we are angry, to agree when we doubt, to apologize for existing differently. These adaptations are intelligent. They protect connection. But over time, they crystallize into an identity built around compliance. Jung understood that what begins as a survival strategy often becomes a prison. The self that was once fluid and expansive hardens into an image. The reliable one, the kind one, the one who never offends. The soul, meanwhile, waits beneath, restless and unfinished, pressing for expression. To disappoint others is to fracture that image, to invite the risk of being seen in our entirety rather than our edited form. And this risk activates some of our oldest biological alarms. The same neural circuits that once warned our ancestors of exile now respond to disapproval. The body interprets disappointment, ours or others, as separation, and separation as threat. The heart rate quickens, the gut tightens, the breath shortens. Everything in us wants to repair, to explain, to make peace. But what if we didn't? What if, for once, we allowed disapproval to stand, not out of defiance, but out of trust that the world will not collapse if someone does not agree with us? This is the beginning of what Jung would call inner authority, the ability to hold one's own center amid the shifting weather of others' reactions. Inner authority does not mean indifference. It means that our sense of rightness comes from alignment, not applause. It requires discernment, the capacity to distinguish between guilt that signals wrongdoing and guilt that signals growth. The first calls for repair. The second calls for expansion. The guilt that arises when we disappoint someone by honoring our truth is often a sign that we are stepping beyond an outdated agreement. one that kept peace at the expense of honesty. To move through that guilt without retreating is to rewire the psyche's relationship to approval. Jung would say we are redistributing psychic energy, withdrawing it from the collective image and investing it in the individual self. The process feels like loss because it is the loss of the person we pretended to be. Every act of authenticity begins as a small betrayal, not of morality, but of expectation. A child grows up and leaves home. A friend chooses differently. A partner speaks a truth that changes the shape of love. These moments hurt because they dismantle the illusions of control we build around one another. Yet Jung believed that such ruptures are the very fabric of evolution. The psyche, like the world, renews itself through death and rebirth. To disappoint others is to allow something old to die, an image, a role, a false agreement, so that something truer can take its place. The pain of that death is real, but so is the vitality that follows. In the space left by approval's absence, a deeper form of connection begins to grow, one rooted not in pleasing, but in presence. Biologically, this process mirrors how the nervous system adapts to stress. Each time we endure disapproval without collapsing, we teach the body a new equation. Rejection does not equal danger. The amygdala fires less intensely, cortisol drops sooner, and the parasympathetic system, the body's calm response, activates more quickly. Over time, we develop resilience, not as armor, but as openness. Jung would describe this as the emergence of a stronger ego, not a swollen one, but a flexible one, capable of holding its ground while remaining receptive. The self becomes less like a brittle wall and more like a rooted tree, firm in its center, gentle at its edges. The courage to disappoint does not mean we stop caring about others. It means we stop manipulating ourselves to control their perceptions. It asks us to trust that love can withstand discomfort, that truth spoken respectfully can coexist with disagreement. Many relationships, Jung observed, falter not from cruelty, but from avoidance, from the unspoken tensions that accumulate when honesty is sacrificed for peace. To bring truth into the open, even when it risks disappointment, is an act of respect. It honors both people as capable of maturity. Real connection cannot grow in pretense. It requires the oxygen of authenticity. In practice, this courage unfolds quietly. It looks like saying no when you mean no, even when your voice shakes. It looks like admitting uncertainty in a culture obsessed with confidence. It looks like declining to apologize for things that are not wrong, or pausing before explaining yourself yet again. Each of these small gestures is a rehearsal in freedom. Jung often reminded his students that psychological change happens not in dramatic revelations, but in these subtle shifts of energy. Moments when the unconscious compulsion to please gives way to conscious choice. Each time you allow disappointment to exist without immediate repair, you expand the boundaries of who you can be. Over time, something unexpected happens. The fear of disappointing others begins to transform into compassion for their disappointment itself. You realize that others, too, are bound by the same fragile need for approval. Their judgments and expectations arise from their own fear of rejection, their own longing to belong. To witness this without resentment is to glimpse what Jung called the transpersonal dimension of consciousness, the awareness that we are all, in some way, learning the same lesson about love and fear. The courage to disappoint thus becomes not separation, but solidarity. The recognition that by freeing yourself, you quietly invite others to do the same. Eventually, this courage matures into serenity. You no longer measure peace by how well you are liked, nor authenticity by how loudly you assert it. You move through life attuned to a subtler compass, the quiet sense of alignment that hums beneath the noise of opinion. Some will still misunderstand you, and that is no longer tragic. Misunderstanding becomes part of the landscape, like wind or rain, something to meet, not fix. Jung would say that this is the threshold of wholeness, when you can stand alone without loneliness, when you can disappoint without guilt, when you can let others carry their own feelings without rescuing them from the weight of your truth. In the end, the courage to disappoint is the courage to be real. It is the decision to trust your inner life more than the fleeting comfort of approval. It is the acceptance that authenticity will sometimes cost you affection, but that the love which remains after truth has been spoken is the only kind worth keeping. To live this way is to step out of the endless performance of explanation and into the calm of self-respect. The world may not always understand you, but in exchange, you gain something far greater, the unshakable sense that your life, even in its imperfection, belongs entirely to you. Chapter 13, Fear, Faith, and Meaning. There are moments in life when fear feels larger than thought, when it floods the body so completely that language shrinks before it. These are the moments that strip away certainty, when plans unravel and control slips through our fingers. For most of us, the instinct is to run, to fix, to rationalize, to distract ourselves with explanations. But Jung believed that when we stand still in the presence of fear, something profound begins to happen. He saw fear not as an error in the human system, but as one of its deepest teachers, a force that draws us toward the mystery of existence itself. In its truest form, fear is not only a biological alarm, it is a summons to meaning. Jung often wrote that fear and faith are not opposites, but companions, two faces of the same experience of the unknown. Fear is the recognition of something larger than the self. Faith is the decision to meet it consciously. To feel fear, then, is to stand at the threshold of revelation. It signals that the psyche has reached the edge of what it knows. We fear what we cannot name because the human mind prefers order to mystery, and yet, it is mystery that gives life its depth. Jung's psychology begins at this borderland, where fear reveals the limits of the ego, and faith begins as an act of humility before the vastness of the unconscious. To understand this, we must first separate fear from danger. Danger is factual. It belongs to the realm of survival. Fear, on the other hand, extends far beyond what threatens the body. It arises when our meaning structures, our beliefs, roles, and identities begin to shake. The death of a loved one, the loss of a job, a sudden illness, or even a quiet moment of existential doubt can unravel the fragile web of stories that hold our sense of self together. The psyche responds as if the ground itself were vanishing. Jung saw this collapse not as pathology, but as initiation. When the old patterns dissolve, a deeper pattern, what he called the self, begins to emerge. Fear is the pain of that emergence, the tearing sound of the old shell breaking. Biologically, the experience of fear and the experience of awe overlap in the brain. The same limbic networks that trigger alarm also ignite wonder when we confront vastness, a storm, a starry sky, the silence of a cathedral. The difference lies in interpretation. When the unknown feels hostile, we call it fear. When it feels sacred, we call it reverence. Jung would say that both experiences are sacred because both remind us of our smallness within the whole. Fear humbles the ego, forcing it to acknowledge forces beyond its control. And this humility, painful as it is the doorway to meaning. It is only when the illusion of control breaks that the psyche opens to the possibility of guidance from something deeper, whether we name it soul, self, or spirit. The transition from fear to faith is not achieved through willpower. It is a slow, organic process, a ripening of perception. At first, fear dominates. Every uncertainty feels catastrophic, every silence like abandonment. But if we can stay with it, breathe with it, and resist the urge to flee, something begins to shift. The edges of fear soften, awareness expands. We start to sense the intelligence within the very forces we once resisted. Jung described this as the emergence of the symbolic attitude, the capacity to see meaning where the literal mind sees only threat. A dark night of the soul becomes not just suffering, but transformation. A loss becomes not just emptiness, but the clearing of space for renewal. To live symbolically is to accept that life speaks through events, not just ideas. Jung believed that every experience carries psychic significance, not because the universe revolves around us, but because consciousness grows through dialogue with the unknown. Fear is one of the ways that dialogue begins. When we ask, "What is this fear asking of me? What is it trying to reveal?" we shift from reaction to relationship. We begin to see fear as communication rather than condemnation. This does not erase pain, but it changes its texture. Pain that carries meaning becomes bearable. Suffering without meaning becomes despair. Jung's psychology, at its heart, is a search for meaning, not as abstraction, but as the force that makes human existence endurable. At times, this search leads beyond the boundaries of reason. Jung wrote often of experiences that could not be explained but only lived. Synchronicities, dreams, intuitions, the sense of being guided by something unseen. He did not ask that we believe in these phenomena as dogma, but that we treat them with respect, as messages from the deeper strata of the psyche. When we are afraid, these signals tend to multiply. Coincidences catch our attention. Dreams grow vivid. The unconscious, Jung said, compensates for imbalance. When the conscious mind is dominated by fear, the unconscious sends images of reassurance, symbols of renewal. Faith, in this sense, is not blind belief, but trust in the psyche's capacity for self-regulation. The quiet conviction that life tends toward wholeness, even when we cannot see how. To cultivate faith amid fear is to practice surrender, not submission, but cooperation with reality. Surrender means allowing what is happening to happen, while staying awake inside it. It means trusting that meaning exists even when it is not yet visible. This is difficult for the modern mind, which equates knowledge with control and uncertainty with failure. But Jung would remind us that the psyche is not a machine to be managed. It is an ecosystem. Just as forests renew themselves after fire, the psyche renews itself through crisis. Fear burns away what is false. Faith is the seed that sprouts in the ash. The more we practice this cooperation, the more we begin to experience a subtle shift in perception. We realize that fear does not dissolve meaning, but reveals it. The very situations that terrify us, Endings, losses, transformations are the ones that most clearly expose what we value. Fear sharpens attention, stripping away trivialities, leaving only what matters. In this way, fear acts as a sculptor of the soul, carving depth into the psyche. Faith is what allows us to hold still while the carving happens. There is an ancient wisdom hidden in this rhythm. Every culture, in its myths and rituals, has recognized that descent precedes renewal, that every hero's journey begins with a fall into darkness. Jung found in these myths a reflection of psychological truth. Fear is initiation. The underworld is not punishment, but preparation. To face fear consciously is to walk through the myth within our own lives, to discover that the monster guarding the treasure is also the gatekeeper to meaning. The treasure, of course, is not power or perfection, but perspective, the realization that we are participants in something vast, mysterious, and ultimately trustworthy. As this realization deepens, life itself begins to feel different. The small fears of disapproval, uncertainty, failure lose some of their force because they are framed within a larger context. Meaning expands the container of experience. We understand that even when pain cannot be avoided, it can be illuminated. Fear becomes less an enemy and more a messenger. Faith becomes less belief and more orientation, the quiet turning of the soul towards significance. Jung would call this the alignment of consciousness with the self, the moment when we begin to sense that what moves through us is the same force that moves through the world. In the end, fear and faith are two movements of the same breath. Fear draws us inward, toward the mystery of existence. Faith exhales us back into participation with it. Between the two lies meaning, the bridge that allows us to live with courage amid uncertainty. When we understand this, we no longer ask to be fearless. We ask instead to be awake, to feel the tremor of fear without shame, to walk through darkness without despair, and to trust that every shattering carries the outline of a new form waiting to emerge. In that trust, fear transforms, not into comfort, but into wonder. And from wonder, faith grows naturally, like light returning at dawn, reminding us that even in the deepest night, life continues to breathe through us. Chapter 14. Detachment without indifference. There is a quiet balance that few people ever master. The ability to care deeply without clinging, to love without losing oneself, to stay present without being consumed. Jung might have called this the art of detachment without indifference, a state in which the self remains rooted even as it opens to the world. It is not coldness or apathy, but a higher form of intimacy, one that honors both connection and independence. Most of us, however, mistake attachment for love, involvement for purpose, and control for responsibility. We confuse presence with possession, and when separation comes, as it always must, we mistake its pain for proof that something went wrong. Yet the truth, Jung would remind us, is that detachment is not the end of love, it is its maturation. In the beginning, we love with grasping hands. We cling to the people, ideas, and roles that make us feel safe, hoping to keep them still so that we, too, can remain still. This is the mind's first attempt to tame impermanence. When a friendship changes, when a partner grows distant, when life refuses to fit our plan, the ego tightens its grip. Beneath that grip lies fear, the fear of loss, of uncertainty, of the void that opens when something familiar disappears. This fear is not weakness, it is instinct. Our ancestors survived by holding close what they could trust. But in the psychological realm, that same reflex becomes suffering. The harder we cling, the more we confuse identity with attachment. Jung saw this as one of the central causes of neurosis. The ego's refusal to let life move through its natural cycles of union and separation. To detach is not to withdraw love. It is to withdraw the illusion of ownership. Love, in its healthiest form, is not a cage but a current. It flows freely between self and other, nourishing both without trapping either. When attachment hardens into dependence, the current stagnates. We begin to measure affection by proximity, attention, and reassurance. The moment those markers fade, anxiety rushes in to fill the space. Jung would say that what we call heartbreak is often not the loss of another person, but the loss of the projection we cast upon them, the image through which we were unknowingly learning about ourselves. The person departs, but what truly collapses is the reflection we depended on to define us. Detachment, then, is not rejection. It is the process of retrieving that projection and returning it to the self. Biologically, this process mirrors the development of the nervous system. Infants are born unable to regulate their emotions alone. They depend on caregivers to mirror calm and safety. Gradually, through co-regulation, the child internalizes this capacity. But when emotional development is interrupted by trauma, inconsistency, or conditional love, the adult psyche may remain externally anchored. Approval, affection, and attention become substitutes for inner stability. Detachment requires reactivating the process that stalled. It asks us to relearn self-regulation, to soothe, to reassure, to comfort ourselves when external validation disappears. Jung would describe this as a reclamation of psychic energy, the movement from outer dependence to inner authority. This transition can feel like loss because the ego equates intensity with meaning. When the nervous system is used to the highs and lows of attachment, the calm of detachment can feel like emptiness. But the emptiness is not absence, it is space. The same kind of space that allows breath to flow or a seed to grow. In this space, something new begins to emerge. Awareness. We start to see others as they are, not as extensions of our unmet needs. We begin to recognize that love without possession is not less profound, but more enduring. Jung believed that this awareness marks a shift from the personal to the transpersonal dimension of love, from dependency to participation in a larger flow of life. To practice detachment without indifference requires attention to two movements of the psyche: holding and releasing. Holding means showing up fully, allowing oneself to feel and care without resistance. Releasing means accepting impermanence, allowing what must change to change. The two movements are not opposites, but phases of the same rhythm. Breath teaches this truth. We inhale to receive. We exhale to let go. To stop either movement is to suffocate. In the same way, attachment without release becomes obsession, and detachment without engagement becomes apathy. The art lies in breathing through relationships, in loving fully while allowing others to be freed. In daily life, this art reveals itself in small, often invisible acts. It looks like listening to someone without rehearsing your reply, caring for their pain without absorbing it, saying goodbye without bitterness. It is the quiet ability to witness another's journey without trying to direct it. Jung once wrote that love is not about perfect understanding, but about the capacity to endure mystery together. Detachment honors that mystery. It says, "I am here with you, but I do not own you. I walk beside you, but your path is your own." Such love expands rather than contracts. It gives life room to breathe. The paradox is that true detachment deepens connection. When we no longer need to control or possess, our attention becomes purer. We listen more deeply, not to confirm our expectations, but to truly hear. We give more generously, not to earn affection, but to express it. The nervous system, freed from the hypervigilance of dependency, begins to rest. Presence replaces performance. Jung might say that love becomes symbolic, not confined to the physical or the personal, but resonant with something archetypal, a pattern older than individuality. To love this way is to participate in the great circulation of energy that sustains life itself. Of course, detachment requires boundaries. To love without losing oneself, one must know where the self ends and the other begins. Boundaries are not walls. They are the architecture of respect. They allow love to flow without collapse. Many people fear that boundaries mean coldness, but Jung would insist the opposite. Boundaries are what make warmth sustainable. Without them, love burns too fast and turns to ash. When we know our limits, what we can give, what we need to replenish, what we must protect, love becomes not sacrifice, but stewardship. At a spiritual level, detachment without indifference is a recognition of impermanence. Everything changes, not because life is cruel, but because it is alive. To hold too tightly to what must move is to resist reality. Jung saw this resistance as the root of suffering, the ego's attempt to fix what is meant to flow. When we loosen our grip, fear softens into trust. We begin to see endings not as failures, but as transformations. The relationship that ends becomes a teacher. The project that fails becomes compost for a new idea. The loss that breaks us becomes the soil in which compassion grows. Detachment does not mean escape from grief. It means faith in renewal. Over time, this faith changes the texture of life itself. We no longer chase permanence because we recognize that depth, not duration, defines meaning. We no longer measure love by possession, but by presence. Jung might describe this as the transition from ego consciousness to self-consciousness, from identifying with the transient to aligning with what endures. The self, as he envisioned it, is not isolated, but interconnected, a center that belongs to the whole. To live from this center is to participate in everything while being consumed by nothing. It is to stand in the current of life, feeling its pull, honoring its direction, without drowning in it. In the end, detachment without indifference is a kind of serenity. It is the moment when love stops being a strategy for security and becomes a reflection of understanding. It is the quiet strength to hold joy lightly, to grieve without despair, to stay open even as we let go. Jung would call this the flowering of consciousness, the point where the heart and the mind no longer compete but collaborate. To live this way is not to withdraw from the world, but to embrace it fully, knowing that every connection, however temporary, is sacred precisely because it will pass. In that awareness, life loses none of its tenderness, only its fear. Chapter 15. The gift of isolation. At first, isolation feels like a punishment. The silence stretches too wide, the air seems too still, and the absence of noise, of validation, of interaction, of busyness begins to echo. We check our phones, open a window, fill the space with sound, anything to drown the stillness that mirrors back the truth we've been avoiding. Jung understood this experience intimately. He believed that solitude is not a defect of living, but one of its great thresholds, the place where the ego, stripped of its social disguises, comes face to face with the self. Isolation, he wrote, is not the absence of connection, but the confrontation with a deeper one. The connection to the unconscious, to that vast internal landscape that can only be heard when the world grows quiet. In modern life, isolation is feared almost as much as failure. We are taught that to be alone is to be unwanted, that solitude is the shadow of irrelevance. The digital world amplifies this fear. Endless connection without true communion, constant activity without reflection. Yet beneath the anxiety of solitude lies something sacred. When the noise subsides, when there is no one left to impress, we begin to hear the subtle pulse of our own interiority. Jung would call this the reorientation of energy from the outer world to the inner one. In his terms, isolation is the psyche's instinctive correction, a withdrawal of libido from external attachments so that it may reconfigure itself. The process is rarely comfortable, but it is profoundly necessary. The discomfort arises because the ego is a social construct. It was built through mirrors, the faces, voices, and expectations of others. When those mirrors vanish, the ego panics. Without reflection, it begins to dissolve, and this dissolution feels like death. Jung called such moments psychic disorientation, the temporary chaos that precedes transformation. The psyche, having relied on external forms for identity, now turns inward to seek a new center. It is a process that can feel like unraveling. Old desires lose their urgency, relationships shift, meaning itself seems to flicker. But in that flickering, something begins to glow, the faint light of authenticity, the first signal of a self no longer dependent on constant validation. Biologically, isolation triggers primal responses. Humans are wired for belonging. The brain interprets prolonged solitude as a kind of deprivation. Studies show that loneliness activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Yet Jung would have noted that these sensations, while real, are not always warnings. Sometimes they are invitations, signals that consciousness is moving through a necessary recalibration. The pain of isolation, like the soreness that follows exercise, is evidence of growth. It shows that the psyche is stretching beyond its habitual boundaries, learning to generate energy from within. The task is to stay long enough in the quiet for this new rhythm to emerge. What often terrifies us in isolation is not the solitude itself, but what it reveals. Without the distractions of interaction, our inner voices grow louder. The unresolved griefs, the doubts, the old narratives we keep too busy to question. Jung believed that these voices are not enemies, but messengers from the unconscious. They rise to consciousness when conditions allow. Isolation, then, acts as a container for encounter. It brings to the surface what collective life suppresses. The sadness that floods in when we are alone is not proof of emptiness. It is memory. The psyche remembering what it has not had time to feel. To face these emotions without fleeing is to engage in what Jung called active imagination, the dialogue between the conscious mind and the living depth beneath it. At first, this dialogue can feel unbearable. We crave witnesses to our experience, someone to affirm that we are still seen. But as we stay, something begins to change. The silence becomes less hostile, more spacious. We start to discern layers within it, textures of thought, waves of feeling, a rhythm that seems to breathe independently of us. This is the presence Jung referred to as the self, the organizing principle of the psyche. It does not speak in words, but in images, intuitions, and quiet certainties. To meet it requires surrender, not of the will, but of the constant need to perform. In isolation, there is nothing to prove, and in that nothingness, we discover an unexpected fullness. Paradoxically, true solitude expands our capacity for connection. When we know how to be alone, relationships cease to be escapes. We no longer approach others to fill a void, but to share what is already full. Jung observed that people who cannot bear solitude tend to lose themselves in collectives, in ideologies, movements, or relationships that substitute belonging for individuality. But those who have made peace with solitude bring a different quality to the world. A calm presence that does not demand, a love that does not cling, an integrity that does not waver with approval. Solitude refines empathy. It teaches us how to listen without agenda, how to give without depletion. To touch our own depth is to recognize it in others. Still, isolation has its thresholds. Too much inwardness can become withdrawal. Too much silence can curdle into despair. Jung warned that the descent into the unconscious must always be balanced by return. After the dialogue with the depths, the task is to bring something back: insight, creativity, compassion, and re-enter the world renewed. Solitude is not meant to be a permanent refuge, but a cycle, a rhythm of retreat and re-emergence. The hermit's cave exists only to teach the pilgrim how to walk differently among others. To remain there is stagnation. To emerge without entering it is shallowness. Growth requires both. In the broader pattern of life, isolation often arrives uninvited, through loss, illness, relocation, or change. It dismantles our routines, empties our schedules, and demands that we meet ourselves directly. In such times, the question shifts from why is this happening to me, to what is this asking of me? Jung would suggest that isolation asks for participation, not in the outer world, but in the inner one. It asks us to see solitude as collaboration with the psyche, as preparation for a deeper engagement with existence. The world, he wrote, will meet us at the depth we have met ourselves. When we finally learn to rest inside this depth, isolation transforms into solitude, and solitude into communion. The same silence that once felt unbearable becomes luminous. We feel the hum of life even in stillness, the quiet intelligence of breath, the pulse beneath thought, the subtle connection between all things. The loneliness dissolves, not because someone else has entered, but because we have. Jung might describe this as individuation achieved in miniature, the ego aligned with the self, the inner and outer reconciled. What once felt like exile now feels like home. In the end, the gift of isolation is clarity. It teaches us to distinguish noise from meaning, performance from presence, dependence from connection. It reveals that the self we feared to meet was never a void, but a mirror, waiting to reflect our own depth back to us. Through solitude, fear becomes familiarity, and familiarity becomes reverence. And when we return to the world, we carry with us a different kind of stillness, one that no crowd can replace and no noise can disturb. It is the stillness of knowing that we belong not because others see us, but because we have finally seen ourselves. Chapter 16. When explanation ends. At some point in every inner journey, there comes a quiet turning. The realization that understanding can go no further, that words have reached their limit, and that the self no longer needs to justify its existence to anyone, not even to itself. Jung often described this as the moment when consciousness begins to live from its depths rather than from its defenses. For most of our lives, we explain, to others, to ourselves, to the invisible audience we imagine watching our every move. We explain our choices so that they make sense, our emotions so they seem reasonable, our pain so it appears dignified. Explanation becomes a kind of armor. It protects us from the vulnerability of being misunderstood. But what if, as Jung suggested, the ultimate task of the psyche is not to explain itself, but to become itself? What if clarity is not something we achieve, but something we outgrow? The human mind is wired for explanation. It seeks patterns, causes, and reasons, a way to transform chaos into coherence. This capacity gave rise to science, philosophy, and language itself. Yet in psychological life, the same impulse can become a trap. Every time we explain who we are, we subtly reduce ourselves to a concept, a narrative small enough to fit within another's comprehension. The more we speak, the more we risk losing contact with the living mystery that underlies our existence. Jung called this the intellect's tyranny over the soul. He did not reject understanding. He was a scientist as much as a mystic. But he warned that the need to explain often masks fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of rejection, fear of standing silently in the vastness of what cannot be resolved. Fear drives explanation because language gives us control. To name an emotion is to distance ourselves from it. To analyze pain is to domesticate it. But the psyche is not a machine that yields to analysis. It is a field of images, instincts, and archetypes that move according to their own rhythms. There are moments when insight dissolves the knot of confusion, and others when insight only tightens it. Jung often said that the unconscious cannot be conquered by intellect. It must be related to. Relationship, unlike analysis, requires the silence. It asks not for control, but for presence. When explanation ends, relationship begins. Ending explanation does not mean abandoning understanding altogether. It means loosening the compulsion to justify. It is the difference between reflection and rehearsal, between knowing and performing. Many people, Jung observed, use self-analysis as a defense against feeling. They turn their emotions into puzzles to be solved rather than experiences to be lived. True consciousness, he believed, arises not from explaining emotions, but from allowing them to exist without judgment. To sit with sadness without a story, to feel fear without constructing a theory, to rest in uncertainty without demanding resolution. This is psychological maturity. It is the point at which the self ceases to perform and begins to inhabit. Biologically, this shift parallels a neurological one. In moments of explanation, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, dominates. In moments of presence, activity shifts toward networks associated with interoception and integration, allowing the body and mind to synchronize. This is why understanding brings relief, but stillness brings peace. Explanation regulates thought. Presence regulates being. Jung intuited this long before neuroscience mapped it. He knew that transformation does not occur when we understand more, but when we resist less. The psyche heals not through explanation, but through participation in its own unfolding. When explanation falls away, authenticity expands. We begin to realize that we can be seen without translating ourselves, that love can exist without performance, that truth does not require an argument. At first, this feels disorienting. The silence of not defending oneself can resemble disappearance. But gradually, we discover that it is not disappearance, but emergence. The energy once spent managing perception becomes available for living. The nervous system, long strained by the effort to justify, begins to relax. Breath deepens. Relationships become simpler. We start to speak less, but mean more. Jung would say that the ego has yielded its obsession with image and has begun to orbit around the self, that deeper organizing center which requires no validation to exist. Still, the ego resists this shift. It fears that without explanation, we will lose connection. That misunderstanding means isolation. Yet the opposite proves true. When we stop explaining, others feel us more directly. The absence of justification allows presence to emerge. True communication, Jung noted, occurs not through the exchange of words, but through resonance between unconsciouses, the quiet recognition that passes beneath speech. When two people meet from that depth, understanding arises without effort. It is not negotiated, but felt, not constructed, but known. This is why many spiritual traditions speak of silence not as emptiness, but as fullness. In silence, meaning overflows the boundaries of language. Jung encountered this in his own work with symbols and dreams. Each image revealed layers of significance that could never be exhausted by explanation. To interpret too quickly was to kill the image. To hold it quietly was to let it live. The same is true for human experience. The more we insist on defining our lives, the more we narrow them. The more we let them breathe, the richer they become. Explanation ends not when ignorance begins, but when reverence begins. When we recognize that some truths are meant to be lived, not spoken. In relationships, this maturity manifests as gentleness. We no longer demand that others explain themselves endlessly to reassure us. We grant them the same freedom we have claimed, the right to be seen in their complexity without being simplified. This mutual silence, paradoxically, deepens intimacy. Words recede, but understanding grows. Jung would call this the presence of the self between individuals, a shared awareness that transcends personal narratives. It is the experience of being together in mystery rather than agreement. In the final stages of individuation, Jung suggested, the psyche turns toward what he called the numinous, that quality of experience which feels larger than the self, charged with significance but beyond comprehension. When explanation ends, the numinous begins. It is not mystical in the supernatural sense, but profoundly human. The awe that comes when we glimpse life's wholeness, when the boundaries between self and world blur. We realize that the need to explain has been replaced by the capacity to trust. Trust in what? In process, in unfolding, in the intelligence of existence itself. Faith, once defined by belief, becomes defined by attention. Eventually, life becomes quieter. The inner monologue softens. We stop trying to make sense of everything and start participating instead. The unknown no longer feels like failure. It feels like home, Jung. We find ourselves living without the constant commentary of justification. We make choices not to prove, but to express. We love not to be understood, but to connect. The nervous system hums in tune with experience, no longer fractured by self-surveillance. Jung might say that the ego has finally become transparent, allowing the self, the deeper pattern of life, to shine through. When explanation ends, life does not become simpler, but clearer. The paradoxes remain: joy and grief, loss and renewal, solitude and connection. But they no longer need resolution. They coexist, like the alternating light and shadow that give depth to the world. The task of explanation is to make life consistent. The task of consciousness is to make it whole. Jung's entire psychology can be distilled to that movement, from the need to explain toward the courage to experience. To live without endless explanation is to live as life itself does, unfolding, undefended, and entirely enough. And in that stillness, where words fall silent and presence remains, we finally understand what Jung meant when he wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are.